Welcome to the second video in my special Cameron Cowan Show Constitution series. I am so excited to be offering this to you. I've been wanting to talk about some of the fun intricacies of the Constitution for a while, and so I can't wait. And this is the fun video because we get to go over some important nuts and bolts of how our government really works and why they do. Now, the Constitution is actually really short. Of the 8.5, 11 types of piece of paper, it is covered in 8. I think if you go to the National Archives, it's on 4 fairly large pieces of parchment. The Constitution is short, it's brief, and it's to the point. And we've added on some amendments, but fairly well, it's done a pretty good job for these 240 years. Now, most of the states, with the exception of Nebraska, who had to have a unicameral legislature, have followed the same basic 3-branch structure of government. If you reach way back in your mind to that civics class you might have taken in middle school or high school, some of these terms will sound familiar. But we're going to go through each one, and if you want to grab a copy of the Constitution or Google one online quickly, I encourage you to do so. You can follow along. Our first branch of government, and I think arguably the most important branch, because it's the one we get a say in, is the legislative branch. Now, in Article 1, Section 1, the Constitution leads off after the preamble. That's the we the people bit. With establishing legislative power. Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Now, the primary job of the legislature, the legislative branch, is to pass laws to be enforced by the executive. Now, Congress has changed a lot in the years. The Senate used to not be by direct election. It used to be senators were voted from members of the state legislatures. So the House of Representatives was to be from the people. The Senate was supposed to be from the states or representing state interest. Obviously, this was changed, and when we get to the amendments, we'll talk all about that, but that will obviously had changed. And a number of representatives has been expanded. In fact, they had to fix it at 435 in the House because as the country grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, they were getting more and more and more representatives, and they were not reapportioning the seats the way they do now, and so it was getting a little big. So now we're fixed to 435, and every 10 years when we do the census, we reorganize that. And when we talk about elections, we'll talk about gerrymandering in districts and how all that works together. So if you're following along, Section 2, there's a couple important things about the House of Representatives. You have to be 25 years old to be elected, and 7 years a citizen, and you have to be a member. You have to be from your district in order to run. It says the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year, so you elect them every 2 years, by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature, which basically says if you can get into your state house, you can get into your House of Representatives. You just merely have to be 25 years of age. Now, the most important thing is that the legislative branch is taxed with raising money and taxes. They're also tasked with choosing a Speaker of the House, and the House has the sole power of impeachment. They also have the sole power. All bills regarding appropriation must begin in the House. The Senate cannot begin an appropriation bill. All those have to start in the House, which is very important. There's a kind of a funny technical thing that is still here. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1. Now, in the beginning, they have to decide when this is going to be done. So they decide the first numbering of people will happen 3 years after the first meeting of Congress. And until then, they basically list out who shall have how many. And it was roughly by population. And then in Section 3, we have the Senate, and it should be composed by 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. As I've said, that is now changed. We vote for them directly. The Senate is also unique in that you only have a third turnover. So because the 6-year terms are staggered, only a third of the Senate overturns is up for election at any given time. So although there's senators up basically every 2 years, there's only a third of the available Senate seats coming and going at any given time. So usually you will not have 2 senators from the same state coming and going at once. They will usually be separate. In fact, I think that is generally speaking true. The Senate also has the job of serving as the jury in any impeachments, and is presided over. Rather, they don't have a speaker. They have the vice president, and they also, whose idea is also to choose someone who sits in for him, especially when he is absent or he has to become the president. So usually in practice these days, the vice president usually will preside over the Senate for a couple days a week, and he frequently is kind of that link between executive and legislative, which is rather important. But usually whoever is the president pro tempore of the Senate, he usually has the most power because he actually has to deal with the day-to-day operations of the Senate. Congress shall assemble at least once every year, and such meetings shall be on the first Monday of December. That's been moved to January, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. So as we go through, you'll begin to see that little tiny changes have happened all throughout. Section 5, each house shall be a judge for elections. If a presidential election is tied, it is up to the House of Representatives to vote, also to determine rules for its proceedings, and punish members for disorderly behavior, or expel a member with 2/3 vote. Section 6, they shall receive a compensation, and shall not hold any other office during this time. Section 7, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House, and all bills shall have to pass the House and the Senate, and they have to. And this is kind of where sometimes the law gets confusing, because, and we get to this in terms of passing laws, is that in order for a law to pass, it has to go be voted and approved in the House, approved in the Senate, has to be signed by the president, or if he signs it, then it becomes a law. If he doesn't sign it, it becomes a law after so many days. And if he vetoes it, then it goes back, and it takes 2/3 majority in both houses to override a veto. Now, usually when a piece of legislation begins in each branch, it has to go to a committee, or sometimes even a subcommittee. But it has to go to a committee, and if the committee approves it for a vote on the floor, then it goes from there. Now, obviously, this sounds very simple, but it's a highly political process. So, if you're a legislator, and you have a piece of legislation written up by the lawyers, and when I worked at the state senate in Colorado, we called them the boys in the basement. You have them written by the lawyers in the basement who do this sort of thing, and then it goes to the floor for what's called first reading. And when it goes for what we used to call them firsts, it goes in, and the clerk usually reads a brief bit of it, literally three to 5 words of it. You have to get through several of these, and then whoever is the head of the chamber, the president pro tem in the Senate, or the Speaker of the House or the House, or whoever they may appoint to fulfill that role, assigns it to a committee. So when I worked in the Senate, My boss had a bill come to the floor for first, and it was assigned to the Judicial Committee. So now it's up to the Judicial Committee to decide if it is worthy of consideration in the whole body. So usually then the committee has hearings on the legislation to see what it's going to do, how much money it's going to cost, who it's going to help, who it's not going to help, why the law needs to be in existence. And if the committee decides that the law is worthy of consideration by the whole body, then it goes from there. So I think one of the pieces of legislation I worked on got to go to the floor. So we call them second readings or seconds. And then that's actually when it is read more fully, not the whole thing, but more fully for second reading, and then is debated by the members on the floor. Usually then at that time, once debate has ended, it goes to what's called thirds. And thirds is when a bill is brought up for a vote. Now, sometimes if they're trying to hurry a piece of legislation through, they'll do thirds on the same day. Usually, however, what happens is after seconds in debate, it is automatically tabled, and this is when you start to get into meeting rules, and Congress's rules are similar to what we had in Colorado, but you start getting into rules of this. Basically, after the second reading, it is auto-tabled until the speaker or the president has on the agenda for third readings. So usually what would happen in the Senate is we would have first at the very beginning of session, we'd have a whole bunch of committee meetings, we'd have seconds kind of in the middle, and then thirds right at the end, and that was when we would vote, or rather my boss would vote, and I would advise him and help him find information, all this type of thing, on how to vote on a lot of things at once. So with third readings, it basically comes back, they read very shortly, they kind of give a summary of the debate, usually in a written format, and then the General Assembly votes. Then it has to go, in the case of Congress, ours went to the governor, from the Senate, and in Congress it goes to the president to be signed or vetoed. Now, there's different kinds of vetoes. Sometimes you'll hear the pocket veto, where the president will use a device to kind of veto it without having to veto it, in terms of just simply not signing it so that it dies, which sometimes Congress will bring it back up and send it back. In this day and age, this doesn't happen very often. Usually by the time a bill gets to the president, we pretty well know if he's going to sign it or not. Usually the White House has already said, yes, we're going to sign this, or no, we're not going to sign this. In your state legislature, it might be a little bit different. Sometimes there can be a question if the governor of your state is willing to sign a piece of legislation or not. So that's always kind of interesting to figure out. Now, here's another quirky thing while bills are being passed. Now, if you have, when a bill goes to the House and Senate, it goes through the exact same process. Committee, floor, vote. Now, in any opportunity, amendments and other edits can be made to the legislation in both houses. So sometimes what will happen is you'll end up with two different pieces of legislation being passed. So then what happens is they take the two pieces, the original House version and the Senate version, and they go to what's called a conference committee. And the president and the speaker appoint people from both parties to go to this conference committee and iron out the changes and create a version that will pass in both houses. Now, oftentimes between second readings and third readings is usually when a conference committee will occur, in order to kind of make sure that it passed third reading. If it goes through third reading, gets voted, goes back to conference committee, then what happens is they have to find a final version and do some politicking, see if it will pass, and then go back and take it for third reading again in order to do the whole process. It's very hard to get a law passed. It's not easy. A lot of things have to come together. A lot of really high and mighty legal language has to go through. It is very, very difficult and confusing. And it can vary based upon the rules of the chambers. It just, again, we're talking about basic framework here, how things are supposed to work. While this were going on with all this, you might have heard a term called filibustering. This is when, during a second reading, if someone refuses to end a debate, thereby preventing a vote, it's called filibustering. This strategy has been used in democratic bodies for a very long time to stop things from getting voted on. It's, to some great or less degree, a rather bit of a desperation move, especially if they think that their set of things is going to lose. And someone can stay in the well and filibuster as long as they stay there, never leave, and never quit talking. There was a time in Congress several years ago, there was someone who would stand in the well and he read his daughter's biology book. This was several years ago. That type of thing goes on to prevent a vote on certain things. And thanks to funky rules and things that we now have, procedural votes and all these different things, that was not laid down in the Constitution, any legislative body subscribes to what's called Robert's Rules of Order, and those rules of order allow them to create the framework by which debate occurs. So, and that kind of gives it a structure so that the business of the legislative body in terms of reading, discussing, and passing laws can occur, especially given the amount of legislation that has to occur these days. So, that's how a bill gets passed. Fun times, right? Now, in Section 8, if you're following along, are all the enumerated powers, what we call basically specific powers the Constitution grants to Congress. And they are as follows: to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. They also include to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is the infamous Interstate Commerce Clause. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. To establish post offices and post roads. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right of their respective writings and discoveries. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money that shall used before a longer term than 2 years. To provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To provide the calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by secession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise the authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Take a breath. One of the most important things was that the Founding Fathers did not expect the federal government to do very much. They really had a mind of keeping government limited, which is, I think, one of the most big things you hear on the right. And indeed, for certain, there's certainly no, I think, other government that has more defined its role than our own. But most of the political power, theoretically, is supposed to reside in Congress. They have very broad-reaching powers. The executive and the judicial are very much restricted in what they can and cannot do. So that is the most important thing here. In my next video, I will whisk you through executive and judicial and the court system and a whole bunch of other fun things. I look forward to seeing you again. Questions, email at CameronCowan.net, at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and Facebook.com/The Cameron Cowan Show. I'll see you next time.